I remember the cold more than the fear. That morning, over France, the air bit through the cockpit glass like needles made of ice and smoke. My name doesn't matter as much as the machine I flew, a B-17G, the kind of fortress that was supposed to keep us alive long enough to make it back across the channel. We called her Lucky Lady, though by the end of that day, luck had nothing to do with it. The sky was gray and bleeding light when we lifted off from the airfield in England. I can still smell the mixture of fuel, oil, and wet grass. The sound of engines warming up was like the growl of some old god waking from sleep. The crew was quiet that morning. Maybe we knew. Sometimes, before the mission even started, you could feel it in your bones. The bad ones had a taste in the air, like metal on your tongue. The flight plan was routine, if such a word can exist in war. We were heading toward a rail yard near Metz, loaded with high explosives, riding at 20,000 feet, with 12 other birds in formation. I'd flown 21 missions before that one. You start thinking the odds are on your side when you've survived that many. You start believing that maybe death is running out of patience with you. Halfway across the channel, the clouds swallowed us whole. The sound inside the B-17 is hard to describe if you've never been there. The roar of the engines, the rattle of the fuselage, the cold air knifing through every seam, the intercom crackling like it was haunted. My co-pilot, Jack Collins, was a boy from Chicago, 19 years old, sharp as a razor. He chewed gum like he was keeping rhythm to the flak bursts he hadn't seen yet. In the back, Sergeant Milton, our tail gunner, kept tapping the photo of his wife that he'd taped near his side. He did that every flight, said it brought him home safe. We all had our small ritual. In the air, they were the only things that made us human. The radio operator, Hayes, was quiet that day. He stared out at the clouds like he expected something to come out of them. And something did. When the first burst of flak went off, it felt like someone had slammed a sledgehammer into the side of the plane. The formation ahead disappeared behind black blossoms of smoke. I remember hearing someone shout, "Bandits!" but my eyes were already scanning the sky. Then I saw Me-109s, sleek and fast, cutting through the gray like silver blades. They came at us head-on. The nose gunner opened up, tracer rounds streaking through the sky. I felt the shudder of every bullet that hit us, like the plane itself was crying out. Then one shell tore through the right wing and exploded inside the bomb bay. Fire, the kind that eats everything. The intercom went dead. The world turned red and white. I shouted at Jack to feather the engine, but he didn't answer. When I looked, he was slumped forward, his hand still on the control. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. I don't know what made me grab the yoke again. Maybe instinct, maybe madness. But the B-17 was bucking like a dying animal, and I had to wrestle her just to keep level. Smoke filled the cockpit. My oxygen mask cracked from the heat, and I could barely see. The smell of burning metal and flesh is something that never leaves you. I remember calling out for the crew one by one, but most didn't answer. The tail was gone. I didn't know it yet, but the explosion had ripped the rear section clean off. Half the aircraft was gone, and yet somehow we were still flying. I told the surviving crew to bail out. Milton was gone, but Hayes and the waist gunner, Price, were still alive. They jumped. I didn't. I couldn't. The controls were locked, jammed, and ready to. I don't know why. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I just couldn't watch her. As the fire spread across the fuselage, I found myself talking to the plane, whispering through the noise. I told her to hold together, that we'd make it home. I talked to her like she could hear me, like she wanted to live. Every time the wind tore at the fuselage, I felt her shudder under me, pieces breaking away, but she kept flying. When we broke through the clouds, the coast of France was below us, black smoke rising from the ground like a graveyard breathing. I started the long, desperate crawl back toward England, the fuel leaking, the instruments dead, the world silent except for the one remaining engine whining. By then, I'd been flying for almost 30 minutes alone in a plane. I could see the ocean ahead, endless and dark. The thought of ditching crossed my mind. I kept pulling, kept praying. My hands were frozen, my heart numb, and I couldn't feel my feet anymore. Of home, of my mother hanging laundry in the spring wind, of my on the porch, of the girl I used to write letters to but never. You start to remember small things when death is beside. I think that's what kept me. I didn't know then that I still had another hour to go before I'd see land again. I didn't know the plane would hold. All I knew was that I couldn't die in a broken sky. Not yet. If you're listening to this, tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels, maybe farther than Lucky Lady ever did. The horizon was nothing but a bruise of gray and silver when I leveled what was left of Lucky. I don't know if level is the right word. She was shaking herself apart, coughing smoke and sparks, the right wing torn open like a wound that refused to close. I could feel every vibration through the seat, through my ribs, through my teeth. The stick felt heavier by the minute, like I was wrestling the very weight of. Somewhere deep inside, part of me had already accepted that I wouldn't make it. But another part, the one that refused to die, kept whispering that maybe I still had one more miracle left. The radio was dead, the compass shattered, and I was flying the light of a dying sun. Sheer stubbornness. Every few minutes, I'd glance out through the cracks, hoping friendly coastline, but all I saw endless water. The smoke trail behind me stretched like a scar across the sky. I thought about bailing out, but the truth was cruel. Half the plane was gone, the tail ripped clean off, the stabilizers barely holding, and I doubted the parachute would clear the spinning wreck. So I stayed. I had no idea how I was even still aloft. Maybe the wind was carrying me. Maybe God was. The silence in the intercom was worse than the gunfire had been. War trains you to live with noise, explosion, the heartbeat of engines, and when that all fades, you start to hear your own thoughts too loud. I spoke to myself, sometimes aloud. I told Jack I was sorry for leaving him there. His body still leaned against the controls beside me, his head bowed as if in prayer. I couldn't move him, couldn't look too long. You'd think in that kind of moment a man would panic, but what I felt, strange calm. The world outside was frozen, distant, almost gentle. Clouds passed beneath me like ghosts, the sunlight turning them into sheets of gold. It was beautiful, and I hated that beautiful, because it felt wrong to die inside something so peaceful. Every mile I made over the channel felt like a year. I watched the fuel gauge tremble near empty. Surviving left engine coughed, spat oil across the glass. I thought of cutting the power and letting her glide, but I didn't trust her wings to hold that long. I just kept flying, kept talking to her like she was a friend holding on with me. "Come on, girl," I said, "just a little farther." Maybe it sounds crazy, but the way the wind pressed against the broken fuselage almost felt like an answer. I'd flown her through 21 missions, patched her up more times than I could count. I knew every sound, every vibration. She wasn't a machine anymore. She was alive in her own way. Somewhere around the halfway mark, I started to lose feeling in my right leg. A piece of shrapnel had cut through my flight suit, and I hadn't even noticed. The pain came and went like lightning, sharp and cold. I tied a strip of cloth around it, one hand still on the controls, and bit down hard until the bleeding slowed. The blood smell mixed with oil and burned metal. It's a scent that stayed with me all these years. I don't think it ever really leaves you. The cold seeped into my bones, into my mind. My breath came in ragged bursts through the cracked mask. I remember thinking how strange it was that fear could feel so quiet, not loud or panicked, just heavy, like a weight pressing your chest that you can't lift. After what must have been 40 minutes, the radio sputtered to life. A few seconds, static, a fragment of a voice, then nothing. I tried sending an SOS transmitter. The only thing that answered me was the wind, and yet I kept trying. Maybe because I couldn't stand the idea that no one would ever know how hard we fought to come home. The clouds thinned, and for a moment I saw the glint of something far below. The water, the channel, cold and endless, waiting. That's when I realized the landing gear was gone too. I couldn't land her. Even if I made it to England, my only hope, glide onto some field, maybe crash soft enough to crawl out alive. But deep down, I think I already knew this wasn't about surviving any. It was about finishing what we started, about not letting go until the sky itself told me. I kept seeing faces in the cloud crew, the men I'd trained with, the ones who didn't make it past their 5th or 6th mission. Their voices filled the cockpit, memories overlapping like radio echoes. Some laughed, some cursed, some sang. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe I just didn't want to be alone. I looked at Jack again, his eyes closed, his hands frozen to the yoke, and I whispered that we were almost there. It felt like lying to him, but it also felt like hope. When the first patch of coastline finally appeared through the haze, I cried. I didn't even realize it at first. The tears froze on my cheeks. I could see the white cliffs in the distance, faint as ghosts. England, home, or at least what was left of it. I don't remember screaming, but I remember the sound of my pounding louder than the engine. The B-17 shuddered again, another piece of metal breaking away into the wind. I was running out of both altitude and time. In that moment, I promised myself that if I lived through it, I'd never take another sunrise for granted, that I'd live big enough for all of them who didn't. And if you've listened this, maybe you feel that too. Maybe you know what it means to fight your way home, even when everything's breaking apart. If you do, take a second. Subscribe to the channel. These stories aren't just mine. They belong to everyone who ever tried to hold their world together when it was falling apart. The closer I got to England, the worse she flew. Every gust of wind felt like a fist punching through what little structure remained. The right wing had a hole big enough for daylight to shine through, the tail section completely gone, the fuselage twisted and moaning under the strain. I was flying a corpse. The gauges were useless, the altimeter spinning like a drunk compass, and the single engine coughed every pull. I had to fly by instinct, just feeling her through the stick, like guiding a dying horse through a storm. The channel below was churning, white-capped, merciless. I'd crossed it dozens of times before, but never like this. It stretched endless, indifferent, waiting to swallow what little was left of us. My left hand was blistered from gripping the controls. My right leg had gone completely numb, the wound leaking through the cloth. The smell of burned wiring filled the cockpit like a sick perfume. I could sparks flickering behind the instrument panel. I kept talking to her anyway, whispering through cracked lips, "Hold together, girl. Please, just hold together." Then the wind shifted. A downdraft slammed us, pitching the nose downward so hard that my head cracked against the canopy. The B-17 groaned, a sound like metal screaming. I fought the yoke with everything I had left, every muscle straining. For a moment, I thought we'd lose it. The horizon tilted, the sea filled the windshield, and I saw the waves rushing up at me. There wasn't time to think, only to act. I pulled back hard. My vision tunneled, the edges turning black, the wings flexed dangerously, the sound of tearing metal echoing through the airframe. Then somehow she leveled again, staggering, barely alive. I gasped for breath, chest heaving, heart pounding like a drum inside a coffin. The engine sputtered but held. I didn't even dare look at the structural damage. I could hear it breaking apart with every mile. I must have been at 5,000 feet, maybe less. The clouds broke apart above me, and shafts of sunlight spilled across the ocean. I could almost see the reflection of the B-17 on the waves, a mangled bird dragging itself through the sky. The absurd beauty of it hit me hard. Here was a machine built for war, designed to rain destruction. In that moment, she was pure courage, defying gravity itself. It made me cry again, though the tears froze as soon as they left my eyes. I thought of how many of us had gone down out here, how many names were still waiting to never come. Somewhere below, their bones slept in the cold depths forever. As I approached the coast, I saw 2 Spitfires circling far above. I thought they were enemy fighters, but then the radio crackled again. Just a burst of static, then a faint British accent shouting something about identification. I tried answering, but all I managed a hiss of static. They must have seen my condition, because one of them dipped its wing, then began to escort me, staying just off my left. I'll never forget that sight. This beautiful, nimble fighter gliding beside my dying bomber like a guardian angel. He was close enough that I could see the pilot's goggles flash in the sunlight. He gave me a thumbs up. A tiny gesture was enough to keep me from giving up. But we weren't safe yet. The clouds thickened again, and the Spitfire disappeared into the haze. I could feel the last engine struggling, oil pressure dropping fast. The propeller blades blurred slower, until they were almost visible. Then it coughed one final time and died. The sudden silence was deafening. The only sound left, howl of the wind through the holes in the fuselage. We began to glide, if you could call it. The descent wasn't smooth. The plane bucked and tilted, the control surface barely responding. My heart thudded against my ribs. I kept my eyes fixed on the coastline ahead, just visible through the mist. I was going to have to land her dead stick. No power, no instruments, half a plane. Below me stretched a patchwork of green fields, hedgerows, and small farms. I aimed for a flat stretch of farmland near a line of trees. It was either that or the sea. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the yoke. The control cables must have been hanging by threads. Every time I adjusted pitch, the whole plane twisted in protest. I called out to Jack again, half whisper, half prayer. "We're almost home, buddy. Just hold on." Of course, he didn't answer, but I liked to believe he could hear me wherever he was. As the ground rushed up to meet me, I cut what remained of the fuel line and locked the flaps, praying they'd still move. Groaned open halfway. Stuck, it would have to do. I lined up the field as best I could, heart hammering, vision swimming with exhaustion. The wind hit the broken fuselage like a hammer, throwing the nose sideways. I corrected, kicked the rudder, fought her back into line. My whole world narrowed to that stretch of field and the feeling in the yoke. Every second stretched into eternity. When we touched down, it wasn't a landing. It was an impact. The wheels tore into the soft earth, the nose pitched forward, and the fuselage snapped again with a sickening crack. I felt my head whip forward, pain exploding through my skull. The cockpit glass shattered, spraying me with shards. Then silence, a silence so deep it felt like I'd gone deaf. The world tilted sideways, my vision flickered, the edges going gray. For a moment, I thought I was dead, but then I heard something. Birds, just birds, and I realized I was still breathing. The cockpit was half buried in mud, smoke rising from the wreckage behind me. I tried to move, but my leg screamed in protest. Somehow, I managed to crawl out through what was left of the side window. The air outside was warm, damp, alive. Grass. I could smell grass. After 90 minutes of flying through fire and death, I was back on Earth, kneeling in the mud, my hands shaking, staring at the wreck had carried me home. Lucky Lady was nothing but a skeleton now, ribs of metal jutting from the earth, her skin scorched and torn. But she'd done it. She'd brought me home. I heard voices then, British farmers running toward me from across the field. One of them shouted, "Bloody hell, he's alive!" I laughed, maybe cried, I can't tell which. Everything blurred together. My lungs burned with smoke. My ears rang, and my body trembled like it wasn't sure whether to live or die. They pulled me out of the wreckage, shouting to each other, wrapping me in a coat. someone pressed a flask into my hand. I remember the taste of whiskey and mud and how good it felt to feel something warm again. I looked back once more at the wreck, smoke curling up toward the sun. I should die in the sky. Everyone said so later. Engineers told me the airframe shouldn't have held. The center of gravity was impossible. The wings were one hit from folding. But sometimes life doesn't care about what's possible. Sometimes it just wants to see how hard you'll fight to stay. They say your life flashes before your eyes when you're about to die. Mine didn't. What flashed before my eyes after I crawled out of that wreck was everything I had left to live for. The smell of rain on the porch back home, the sound of my mother's laughter through a kitchen window, the way the sun used to hit the cornfields behind our house in Ohio. I hadn't thought about in months, maybe years. The war had stripped them away, layer by layer, until I was just a man made of instinct and order. But standing there, looking at the smoking remains of Lucky Lake, those memories came flooding back, dam breaking. I remember trying to stand, my legs buckling under me, the world spinning. The British farmers helped me up, their voices distant and muffled, like I was underwater. One of them asked my name, but I couldn't get the words out. My throat was raw, my body numb. All I could manage was, "She made it. She brought me home." They probably thought I was delirious. Maybe I was. An ambulance came an hour later. They carried me to a small field hospital not far from the coast. I remember the ceiling overhead, smell of antiseptic mixing with the faint scent of engine oil still clinging to my clothes. A nurse with kind eyes cleaned the blood off my face. I tried to tell her about the others, Jack, Hayes, Milton, but the words tangled in my throat. She just nodded softly and told me to rest. I couldn't. I closed my eyes, but all I saw were flashes of the sky tearing open, the sound of metal screaming, the faces of men who trusted me to bring them home. Every time I drifted off, I woke again with my hands gripping imaginary controls, my heart racing. The doctor told me later that I'd suffered from oxygen deprivation, shock, and burns, but he didn't have a name for what was really wrong with me. None of them did. That night, after they stitched me up and left me alone, I limped outside the tent. Sky clear, stars scattered like shattered glass. Somewhere out there beyond that dark horizon, my crew was, some floating in the channel, some maybe still out there in the wreckage that hadn't made it back. I stood there in the cold, feeling small beneath all that emptiness. Then I saw the outline of another B-17 flying overhead, steady and whole, its engines humming like a hymn. I saluted without thinking. I think I needed to believe that something still made sense in that madness. The next morning, a group of officers came to see me. They wanted to hear the story, how the hell I'd managed to keep half a bomber in the air for over 90 minutes. I told them everything, at least remembered. They didn't believe me at first. Then they sent a team to the crash site. When they came back, their faces were pale. The tail section had been found 20 miles behind where I'd landed. There were bullet holes the size of fists through the wings. The entire rear fuselage was missing, yet somehow the controls had still responded enough to steer. One of the engineers told me later that it defied every law of aerodynamics he knew. I told him maybe it wasn't aerodynamics that kept me flying. It was something else. They gave me a medal a few weeks. I remember the ceremony, the general shaking my hand, the flash of the camera, the applause, but it all felt distant, hollow. The medal was cold and heavy, and all I could think about the empty seats in the mess hall, the ones that would never be filled again. I kept seeing Jack's hand controlled, Milton's photo taped to the turret, Hayes, they were gone, but they never left me. When I looked at that medal later, all I saw were ghosts. After I was discharged, they sent me back home to recover. The war was still raging, but I was done. My body healed, but my mind didn't. Back in Ohio, the world looked smaller. People asked questions, know how. They wanted stories, bravery, heroism, victory. But war isn't made of it. It's made of fear and loss and 1,000 small choices, dying, living one more night. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing engines roaring, feeling the stick in my hands again, the vibration of dying metal beneath me. I'd stumble to the porch and sit there until dawn, watching the horizon. The sunrise always came the same way it did that morning over France, soft, slow, golden. Sometimes I'd imagine lucky lady up there still, flying somewhere beyond sight, holding herself together the way people said I was lucky. They said it so often it stopped sounding like a compliment and started feeling like a curse. Lucky to be alive, maybe. But the truth is, luck didn't save me. It was something harder, something stubborn, the kind of thing that refuses to break even when everything else does. I carried that with me for the rest of my life. Years later, when I visited the remains of the airfield in England, it was nothing but weeds and silence. The hangars were gone, the runways cracked and overgrown, but I could still hear the echo, engines starting, men laughing nervously, call of bombs away, fading into the cloud. I stood there alone for a long time, running my hand through the grass where Lucky Lady once rested before her final flight. I whispered to her again, just like I had at cockpit. "We made it home, girl." The wind answered softly through the tall grass. Sometimes I wonder what kept her in the air. Science says it shouldn't have happened. Physics says it was impossible. But I've learned that the line between impossible and miraculous is thin as a thread. Maybe she flew because I needed her to. Maybe because the souls of those who didn't make it were holding her together, but for me. And maybe every time I tell this story, a part of her keeps flying still across time, memory, across every man and woman who ever refused when the world, it was over. Tell me something, though. If you'd been in that sky with everything broken and no one left beside you, would you have held on too? Comment below and tell me, just write this. I would have held on. I want to see how many of you would have kept fighting, no matter the odds. When the war finally ended, I didn't feel the way I thought I would. There were celebrations in the streets, music, flags waving, people kissing strangers under the confetti of peace. But inside me, there was only quiet. Not relief, not joy, just quiet, like a storm had passed and left an empty field behind. The letters came first. Condolences from families of men I'd flown with, letters typed in perfect military form, each one a mirror of the next. "We regret to inform you, we honor his sacrifice," but no letter could ever explain the silence they left. I tried to write back to some of them, the mothers and wives, the girls who had waited, but every time I sat down, the words, what say? That their sons died well, that they were brave. Brave isn't enough when you've seen what courage cost. The nightmares never stopped. In my dreams, the plane was always breaking again. The same scream of metal, the same smell of fire, the same voice over the intercom that I couldn't answer. I'd wake up choking on my own breath, my hands clawing at the air as if the yolk were still in them. I tried to drown it with whiskey for a while, tried to bury it under work, under the rhythm of normal life. I fixed cars, built barns, married a woman who deserved a better man than I could ever be. She used to find me sitting up at night, staring out the window, the moonlight on my face. I told her to sleep because of it. It wasn't. It was the sound of engines that weren't there. There's something they don't tell you about surviving. It isn't the dying that haunts you. It's the living after. The way you start measuring every moment against the one you shouldn't have had. Every sunrise feels borrowed. Every laugh feels undeserved. You start to carry ghosts in your shadow, invisible but always near. I'd go to the air shows sometimes just to hear the old engines roar again, the deep, throaty growl of radial pistons echoing through the air. People cheered when the bombers flew by, waving their flags, taking pictures. I stood there with my hands trembling, tears burning my eyes, because the sound wasn't just noise to me. It was memory. It was loss. Decades went by before I spoke of that day again. The story lived inside me like a locked box afraid to open. When my son grew old enough to ask about the war, I didn't know what to tell him. I didn't want him to see his father as some kind of hero. Heroes are statues. I was just a man trying not to die. But one night, when he was about 17, he found my medal and the yellowed photo of Lucky Lady that I kept folded in an old wallet. He asked what happened to her. I told him the truth, or at least enough of it. I told him about Jack, about the fire, about the sky tearing open and refusing to let me fall. I told him courage isn't the absence of fear. It's flying through fear so thick you can't breathe and doing it anyway. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he asked me something I wasn't ready for. Dad, why did you stay in the plane? I sat there for a long time, staring at my hands, the same hands that had once gripped that burning yoke. I told him I didn't know, but later, when I was alone, I realized maybe I did. Maybe because I couldn't let go of her. The plane, the crew, the mission, the promise that we'd make it home together. Maybe because letting go would have meant surrendering to something I wasn't ready to face. Or maybe I just wanted to prove that even broken things can still fly if they have enough heart left in them. I visited the crash site again in the 1970s. The field was still there, green and quiet. The farmer who owned the land remembered the story. He showed me where they'd buried what was left of Lucky Lady's fuselage in the soil after the recovery crews came. We stood there in the wind, the grass swaying, and I could almost hear her again, that low hum in the distance that wasn't really there. I knelt down and pressed my hand to the ground. It was warm, alive, and I whispered, "Thank you." Maybe it was for her. Maybe it was for the men who never came home. Maybe the version of me that never really left that cockpit. That night, I dreamt of her again. But this time, it wasn't the fire or the smoke. She was flying, whole, her wings unbroken, the sunlight gleaming off her silver skin. I was in the pilot's, Jack beside me, the crew laughing in the back. The sky was endless and calm. No flak, no fighters, no fear, just wind and light and the hum of engines that never faltered. I woke up crying, but it wasn't pain this. Maybe that's how the dead talk to the living, through the dreams we're finally strong enough to have. The older I got, quieter the world became. The engines that once roared in my ears faded into the background hum of time. People forgot the sound of those planes, the smell of the airfields, the weight of the silence after a mission. But for me, it never really went away. Some memories fade like old photographs, but others burn themselves into you so deep that even when your body grows frail, your mind still trembles at their echo. The war became history, printed in books, taught in classrooms, wrapped in numbers and names. But war isn't numbers, it's faces. It's the sound of a friend's voice cut off mid-sentence. It's the shaking of your hands when the gunfire stops and you realize you're still breathing when someone else isn't. That's what stays. I used to sit on my porch with a cup of coffee at dawn, watching the mist lift off the field. Some mornings, the wind carried a sound, a low rumble, distant but familiar. It was probably just a truck on the highway, but in my heart, I knew it was. It was her, Lucky Lady. Maybe not her in metal and rivets, but her spirit, her will, the ghost of her flight. I'd close my eyes again, hands on controls, eyes on the horizon, the world breaking apart around me, and yet somehow still holding. The older I became, the more I understood that survival isn't about strength. It's about grace, about finding beauty in the wreckage, about learning to live with what you've lost without letting it turn you in. I met other veterans over the years, some from the air, some from the ground, all carrying their own ghost. We didn't talk about it much. We didn't have to. There's a language only the broken understand, a kind of silence that speaks louder than words. When we did talk, it was about small things, the food, the weather, the women we'd loved and lost. But behind every story, a shared understanding that none of us really came back the same. The world had moved on without us, and we were just trying to find where we fit in it again. Some never did. When my wife passed, the house grew unbearably empty. I'd sit by the window in the evenings, the light fading across the floor, and I'd think about how time erases everything if you let it. Faces, laughter, voices, they all fade. The sound of that engine, the feeling of the stick in my hands, the smell of the cold metal, that never left. I think that's because it wasn't just a moment of survival. It was the moment I understood what it means to keep living even when you have every reason not to. The war tried to teach me how to die, but that day, Lucky Lady taught me how to live. I sometimes wonder what she would have looked like if she'd survived too, if she hadn't been torn in half, if she'd been restored, put in a museum somewhere for people to admire. But maybe she wasn't meant to last that way. Maybe she was meant to exist in memory only, to live through the stories of those who saw her defy the impossible. I've met a few young pilots who heard about her, kids who never saw war but still feel that hunger for the sky. They ask me what it was like up there. I tell them the truth. It was terrible and beautiful. It was everything that makes a man break and everything that makes him whole. In my final years, I started writing letters I never sent. Jack, to Milton, to Hayes. I'd tell them about the season, about how the fields back home still turned gold in the fall, about how quiet the nights had become. Sometimes I'd fold those letters and bury them under the oak tree near the barn. It made me feel like they were still, I don't know, to hear me, but I like to think they do. There's peace in knowing that broken things still, that even torn in half, some part of you carry on long enough to touch home. Maybe that's what life really is, a long flight through fire and fear, held together by faith and stubbornness, and maybe that's enough. Now that my hands tremble when I write and my eyes blur before the lines are finished, I find myself thinking less of the war itself and more about what came after. Time has a strange way of softening even the hardest. The pain dulls, the faces fade, but what remains is the feeling, that quiet, unspoken sense that you lived through something bigger than yourself and somehow came out the other side. Sometimes I walk to the old airfield that was built not far from my house, where small planes would fall. The hum of their engines feels like an echo, another life. I stand there, leaning on my cane, watching those young pilots climb into their machines with that same spark in their eyes we all once had. They wave before takeoff the way we used to. And when they lift off into that open sky for a moment, I can almost feel her again beneath my hands. Lucky Lady. She's been gone for decades. But the way she flew, the way she held together when everything said she shouldn't, that stayed with me longer than anything else. I think that's what legacy really means. Not medals, not records, just the quiet endurance of what we build, what we protect, what we refuse to let die. The world moved on without us. Built faster planes, bigger wars, new names for old fears. But sometimes, when the air is still, I swear I can hear those old B-17s rumbling somewhere above the clouds, like they never stopped flying, just moved beyond. Maybe that's heaven for men like a sky that never ends, a crew that never breaks, a mission that never needs another tomorrow. I used to be afraid of dying, afraid that the darkness would come for me the way it came for so many others. But I'm not anymore, because I've already been there. 90 minutes of fire licking at the wings, silence filling the cockpit, the edge of the world waiting below. I came through it. Death isn't the end. It's just another flight path, another crossing, and maybe when the time comes, Lucky Lady will be there waiting, engines humming, canopy open, Jack in the co-pilot seat smiling like he used to. Maybe this time we'll fly without fear. People ask me, after all these years, what the secret was, how I kept that broken plane in the air, how I stayed alive when physics said I shouldn't have. I tell them it wasn't skill, it wasn't luck, it was faith. Not the kind you find in a church, but the kind that's born in the sky, when you've got nothing left but your hands and your will. It was belief in the men beside me, in the machine beneath me, in the idea that even when the world falls apart, something inside you doesn't have. I'm an old man now, and this story is all I have left to give. If you're hearing it, maybe it's because you need to. Maybe because somewhere in your life, something's breaking too and you're trying to keep it in the air. If that's true, then remember this. Lucky Lady flew for 90 minutes without a tail, without a prayer, without half her heart, and she still made it home. So can you. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you've lost or something you've survived, take a moment, hit the like button, subscribe, and stay with me here. There are more stories to tell, stories of men and women who flew through their own storms and somehow found the strength to land, because as long as we keep telling them, they'll never really fall from the sky.